Making an open-world game can be extremely challenging, especially if you're trying to balance a compelling narrative with player freedom, interesting level design, and fun activities, while ensuring it all runs smoothly. Not every open-world game can achieve some or all of that, and the sheer hype around them can only amplify one's disappointment. So, let's take a look at 15 of the most disappointing open-world games that stumbled in one way or another. Before we begin, please consider subscribing and enabling all notifications by clicking the bell icon. With that out of the way, let's get started. Two Worlds. The timing of Two Worlds' release, coming up after The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, might seem like it created lots of unfair expectations. Unfortunately, this wasn't helped by developer Zuxez proclaiming it to be a more focused, grittier experience than Oblivion, with much more complex magic, a more complex society, and more depth to the horse riding. The final result was a mess, with graphical issues, a cliched story wrought with awful voice acting, repetitive combat, and bugs galore. Some of the environments looked nice and the world was appropriately large, but that deep horse riding was a nightmare to control, souring the experience all the more. Overall, Two Worlds is looked back upon as a meme and an albatross that its successor had to bear. Driver. The backlash against Driver wasn't necessarily due to it being a bad open-world game. It was also because no one really asked for it to go down the route of implementing third-person shooting or escapes on foot. Though providing 3 large cities to explore, there was very little to do outside of the main story missions, unless you really liked raising your notoriety level and evading the idiotic police. Unfortunately, Driver was also a bad game overall, with the driving suffering from terrible controls and physics, terrible AI, and numerous graphical and performance issues. HOMEFRONT: The Revolution. Financial problems, mismanagement, resignations, and much more plagued HOMEFRONT: The Revolution through its many years of development. The final product didn't have much hope of success, but it was still a shame to see an interesting premise and setting face so many issues, whether it's in the terrible stealth, a disappointing story, or scores of technical bugs. The side objectives felt tacked on, as you did little more than go somewhere and shoot or hack something, until you get to the civilian areas, and these take on even more asinine objectives. It could have been so much more, but alas. Fuel. One of those open-world concepts that sounds cool in theory, but ultimately faltered in practice was Asobo Studios' Fuel. It was a racing game with an open-world map that ranged 5,560 square miles in size. You could drive anywhere, but unfortunately, there weren't a lot of interesting things to see, like the sandstorms and other weather effects, which were just too infrequent. Throw in some rubber band AI with lackluster controls and racing, and Fuel was just another neat idea that couldn't live up to its epic scale. CYBERPUNK 2077. Even with all of the mixed opinions surrounding CYBERPUNK 2077, from those that enjoyed the story and characters to those who felt lied to about missing features, a good chunk of players agreed that the open world was lackluster. Various NPCs meander about with little semblance of intelligence. Police pop out of thin air when you commit a crime, even in the latest update, but somewhat farther away and taking more time to respond. Despite some interesting random events, there are no car chases in the open world, mini-games to play, brain dance activities to partake in, subways to ride, nothing. Some of the side missions tell some good stories, but others default to go here and kill this person, or finding cars for Delamain. Mad Max. Avalanche Studios' Mad Max is another title that evoked mixed reactions. Many liked its world design, which echoed the post-apocalyptic landscape of the films, but some found it to be barren. Strongholds could be fun to liberate, but were overall lacking in meaningful depth. You could venture out into the big nothing to garner rare parts for your vehicle, the magnum opus, battling sandstorms in the process, or engage in car combat. But the overall survival elements felt lackluster and inconsistent, while many of the missions were too samey and repetitive. It overall depended on how much you really loved the Mad Max atmosphere, and whether that's enough to forgive some of the more grievous issues. Ghost Recon Breakpoint. It's been said before, but bears repeating. No one really asked for an open-world Ghost Recon game, but Wildlands defied a middling critical reception and made it work. By that token, Ghost Recon Breakpoint simply had to build on what was there. Even without taking the live service model, horrible story, looter-shooter elements, and lack of squad AI into account, the world itself was just plain boring to explore, with unimaginative biomes that the survival mechanics failed to properly leverage, and boring bullet-sponge drones. Infiltrating bases could still be fun, but the horrible enemy AI sapped all challenge out of being stealthy. Once again, Ubisoft would improve Breakpoint post-launch, but its open world is still the least compelling of all of its franchises to explore. Fallout 76. At launch, it was crazy to look back on director Todd Howard's claim of 16 times the detail and 4 times the size of Fallout 4 when describing Fallout 76's map. There were no NPCs, which meant that the dialogue system was completely gutted and most everything was doled out via long-winded holotape conversations. Never mind the lame nuclear launches and Scorchbeast Queen fight, numerous bugs, abysmal gameplay and graphics that was simply embarrassing to behold. More varied content and stories eventually made their way to the game via free updates like Wastelanders, but Fallout 76 is still tied with the console-exclusive Brotherhood of Steel for the weakest title in the series. Rage 2. Considering all the hype around the first game and how much it disappointed, Rage 2 was at least expected to deliver a more compelling world. Unfortunately, the boring story and boring characters were accompanied by lifeless towns and lame NPCs. Even if you ignore the plot and just venture out into the wasteland, you'll encounter the same boring authority towers and clear various outposts that have very few distinguishing features gameplay-wise. There could have been potential with the vehicular combat, but that's also boiled down to the same rudimentary encounters again and again. Deadly Premonition 2, a blessing in disguise. The first Deadly Premonition wasn't a universal darling among critics, but its unorthodox gameplay and world design made it stand out among the crowd, enough to garner a strong cult following. Unfortunately, Deadly Premonition 2, A Blessing in Disguise, fails to really capture that same magic, save for its bizarre writing. The performance is horrendous, dissuading you from experiencing any of the side activities or exploring leisurely, and even after updates, it never really improved. Several missions boiled down to simple fetch quests, the investigative mechanics were lackluster, and it's all just so mind-numbingly repetitious. Anthem. BioWare wasn't content to make one of the worst looter-shooter titles of all time. It also presented a bad story, told through awkward first-person cutscenes where decisions had no impact on anything. Once you went beyond the wall into the open world, the thrill of flying quickly wore off, and the utter lack of interesting events, locations, side quests and enemies assailed you endlessly, when connection issues and bugs weren't ruining the gameplay. For as gorgeous as some of its vistas could look, Anthem's world was ultimately a movie set that lacked any real substance. Watch Dogs. With all the hype surrounding Watch Dogs, you'd have expected it to be a magnum opus, rivaling the likes of Grand Theft Auto 5. It wasn't, especially when it came to the multitudes of bugs, downgraded graphics, and boring story. While the hacking mechanics could be fun, Chicago just came across as lifeless and lacking in any innovative activities, and don't even get us started on the abysmal driving. Going to Watch Dogs 2 and seeing just how much more imaginative and fun San Francisco could be only underscored the drab nature of the first game's world design all the more. Assassin's Creed Unity. From a technical standpoint, Assassin's Creed Unity was and continues to be very impressive, rendering obscenely large crowds and detailed locations. Unfortunately, it was pretty much broken at launch in terms of performance, with bugs and crashes harming the experience. It's largely improved thanks to numerous patches after launch, and the sandbox nature of the missions, combined with the stellar recreation of Paris, finally got a chance to shine. The act of moving through the city was very clunky though, thanks to revamped movement and control systems, not to mention all of the different corners and props that could trip you up. Co-op was balked, and combat didn't particularly shine either. If you're interested in simply basking in the view, then Unity could be interesting, but its design and overall gameplay were a big step down from Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Fable 3. After a stellar showing in Fable 2, which offered a world where players could truly immerse themselves and build a life, Fable 3 felt a bit wanting. Much of this had to do with the premise of you becoming a monarch and building up a kingdom to defeat the baddies. Not only did it feel extremely restrictive, but the overall scope was very pared down in terms of story, progression, and role-playing. But hey, at least you could buy properties, so there is that. The Crew. Featuring a much more serious storyline and premise, The Crew had a persistent online open world that recreated the entire United States, albeit on a smaller scale. Famous cities like Dallas, San Francisco, Detroit, and more were featured, and you could team up with other players in this massive sandbox to undertake missions. But when you really dug into The Crew, its ambition felt skin deep. The presentation was poor, texture pop-in and graphical bugs were consistent, the AI was terrible, and the side missions were repetitive when they weren't annoying. Even worse is that servers going down in the middle of a run meant that you could lose a ton of progress, besides being locked out of the game due to its always online nature. So what are your thoughts on this? Go ahead and share them in the comments below. And if you like this video, please subscribe to the channel and enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon to get new video updates. We upload every day and would really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching.